We're a couple months into the technical preview of Sins of a Solar Empire 2, and one of the most common complaints I've seen, at least on my own videos, is that it doesn't seem to be a real sequel, instead being just a remaster or a remake. And I really disagree with that, so I wanted to take a look at what that may mean to people, or why people may feel that way. I think there's a few angles to look at this from. There's the graphics, the gameplay mechanics, the under-the-hood stuff, and the content, meaning the factions and units that you're actually playing with. It's kind of hard to say exactly what the definition is between a remaster, remake, or sequel in this context. Usually I think people gauge this by story elements or campaigns, and having a new one of those is enough to classify a game as a sequel, since nobody ever really questions, say, Call of Duty games with fewer changes to the engine or core gameplay as being a sequel, even if the criticism is still there that they're just releasing the same game over and over. Sins starts from a bit of a disadvantage compared to a lot of other games here, since while there's some background evolution of the world that the game is set in, since the game is set 30 years later, which is why the designs for all the ships are different, it's not really a narrative game. There's no story campaign to point to as a sequel to prior story events that really impacts what you're doing. In practice, that just means a difference in what the opening cinematic will yell at us before we get to the menu. We're not going to be hearing our many sovereign worlds anymore. People may also point to ships having mostly the same name with the TEC so far, since even though there are evolutions of those designs, the core ideas to the factions are the same and there's no new factions. So maybe that's why the idea is persisting, but I personally don't think that's enough to say that it's not really a sequel. It's possible more of this will become apparent to people when they've played it for themselves, especially as more content actually gets added, but in my opinion the changes to the gameplay, graphics, and engine more than justify the little 2 at the end of the name. There's still of course some placeholder assets from the first game in the test build, but these are just placeholders. Many of those icons, models, or sound effects have already been replaced and will continue to get replaced as new updates come out. And you can even see the difference graphically just from looking at some of those stand-ins, let alone from doing a full comparison between the first game and this one. Things like rotating or tracking turrets on the ships are also indicative not just of differences in how the game is handled graphically, but in gameplay. The weapon banks and functions are way more in-depth than the first game, which should have some more clear impacts on combat as we get to the point where balance becomes a bigger focus in development, and especially once multiplayer matches start happening. Similarly with gameplay, most of the empire management, diplomacy, minor factions, and just basic 4X elements have a different twist to them than they did in the first game. The orbital body mechanics, where the planets actually move around the map, make a huge difference in how I've played. It'll be hard to know where the economy comparisons will land, since that's been getting the most changes every version of any gameplay element, but Stardock and Ironclad have also commented on how different factions will have a lot more changes in how they play relative to each other, including things like trade only being for the TEC. That's something that's not going to come through right now since we only have the TEC factions to look at. I believe the Visari is the next faction to show up in the game, and I think the Visari updates, as well as the multiplayer updates, are the two main points where the game is really going to have to convince people to jump on board or not. I think for a game that's doing so much in early access, by the time we're at the full 1.0 release, it's probably going to be too late for a lot of people. For the under-the-hood elements though, that's something less indicative of a remake, sequel, or remaster, since any of those can have a new engine or engine upgrade. But ultimately, pedantic definitions aside, I think the core of what people mean when they say it doesn't qualify as a sequel is that the game doesn't seem to justify to them its existence over the first game. So I do think the engine is worth talking about in that context. A lot of the gameplay elements or graphical upgrades obviously come from the engine changes, but it's just flat out capable of handling more things. The projectiles acting like actual projectiles compared to the damage packets that they were before, and the rotating turrets wouldn't have been feasible in the original Sins engine. This makes a lot of things possible not just for the base game, but also for mods which just couldn't have been done before. You obviously can't give the base game credit necessarily for things mods will do later, but considering how big of an impact modding had on the first Sins and the fact that Sins 2 is partially being made with the help of modders from Sins 1 mods, I do think it's worth bringing up. We'll be able to do things in Sins 2 that we just never could do in Sins 1 no matter how long our buff chains were. So really, I think unless you have a strict definition that there needs to be a new faction or a new story campaign, Sins 2 will earn its title. As an early technical preview, it's probably still too early for most people to run out and grab it just yet, but for me at least what's there has a lot of promise, and I'm still really looking forward to more.